Welcome to Scriptural Works, a podcast that engages Scripture in new and innovative ways to produce meaning for today's postmodern world. Co-host Greg Camp, Professor Emeritus, Pastor and Biblical Scholar, and Patrick Spencer, Biblical Scholar and Silicon Valley Tech Executive, employ various interpretive approaches to generate new meaning from ancient text, revealing timeless wisdom relevant for ministers, lay leaders, and interested readers of the Bible. Get more podcast articles and other useful resources at scripturalworks.com. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Scriptural Works. I'm here with my co-host Greg Camp. Greg, good to see you as always.
As always, very good.
And we are joined with a special guest today. Everyone's going to find it really interesting. I've always found his writing quite engaging and thought-provoking. He co-chaired a session at the SBL where I read a paper, I guess it's been 20 years ago or something like that, Tom, right? It's been a long time ago. Tom Phillips joined us from down in Southern California. We're going to actually do a follow-up podcast to this one about some of the work that he's doing over at the Digital Theological Library, which we think our audience is going to find quite interesting. We have. So we'll do a deep dive there. We won't spend much time on today's podcast talking about it. Instead, this is part of our continuation of our The End is the Beginning series, where we look at the four endings of the Synoptic Gospels as well as the book of Acts. And Tom, having spent a large chunk of his academic career in Luke Acts, we thought would be a perfect candidate for today's show. So Tom, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here.
Thanks. So I'll give a little quick intro on Tom. He's the executive director of the Digital Theological Library, which is focused on transforming theological education by creating an innovative co-owned digital library that allows seminaries worldwide to share resources, reduce cost, and democratize access to scholarly materials. As I said, we're going to do a full-blown hour-long or so conversation with him here for one of our upcoming podcasts, so make sure to watch for that. He has a PhD in Christian origins from Southern Methodist University. He studied under Joseph Tyson with extensive teaching experience at institutions including the long list here: Eastern Nazarene College, Fuller, Colorado Christian, Point Loma Nazarene University, and then most recently over at Claremont School of Theology. He's authored, as I mentioned, a lot of different books: Reading Issues of Wealth and Poverty in Luke Acts, a monograph, Paul's Letters and Acts, which we'll talk about probably both of them during today's podcast, I suspect. He's the lead translator for the Gospel of Luke in the Common English Bible, which came out back in 2010. He's the editor of major scholarly collections that include Contemporary Studies in Acts. I have that in my library. Acts and Ethics, another one in my library. And he's the co-editor of Literary Studies in Acts Essays in honor of his professor, Joseph Tyson. Was published back in 1998. I have that in my library as well. I love reading Tom's stuff. He's a fellow of the prestigious Westar Institute, a pioneer in applying modern literary theory to biblical interpretation through works like Acts with diverse frames of reference. It's going to be an exciting conversation. Before we dive into the details with him, a quick blurb from our sponsor. Are you ready to take your calling deeper? Abilene Christian University's Graduate School of Theology offers master's, doctoral, and certificate programs designed to equip ministers, scholars, and leaders for transformative service. Whether you're pursuing a Master of Divinity, a Doctor of Ministry, or a graduate certificate in practical ministry, Abilene Christian University's flexible online and on-campus options help you to grow in faith and impact. You can learn more at acu.edu/GST. That's acu.edu/GST. Now they've got all that stuff behind us. Tom, you need a longer bio. I'm impressed. I'll let Greg kick it off with a question that he has for you.
Yeah, Tom, many of us find our ways into our areas of interest by just kind of wandering into things, bumping into them in the night, so to speak. How did you find your way into your interest in Luke and Acts?
Yeah, I was in graduate school, and my first interest was the pastoral epistles, and I was intrigued by the idea of pseudonymy and somebody writing in Paul's name and trying to interpret Paul for the next generation. my Pauline professor that I ran the idea by said, "That's a disaster. Nobody will ever hire you. Do something more marketable." So that idea of updating Paul for the next generation, I began to think about Acts. And I did my dissertation on issues of wealth and poverty in Luke Acts. I was interested in that because of the ethical implications, the distribution of wealth in our world, the presence then and now of extreme wealth and extreme poverty in the same on the same globe, and even often within almost a literal stone's throw of one another, of people who claim to have Christian faith. And it seemed to me that the Bible ought to have something to say to that. So that's how I got into Luke Acts. I was interested in sort of the reception of Paul. And I got into issues of wealth and poverty because I thought it was the central theological issue of the day that was largely being ignored. Uh, yeah.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. It is certainly a dominant thing that comes out in Luke and Acts.
Yeah.
Perhaps more so than the other Gospels.
And Tom, you taught at a lot of different places we discussed in the introduction. It might be helpful for our audience. I don't think we had this originally as one of the questions, but it'd probably be helpful for you to give them an overview of, sort of your academic path. And you ended up at Claremont, and then you ended up leaving, and you've been running the DTL.
Yeah, when people find out I'm a librarian, they sort of assume that I got a master's of library science out of college and maybe out of seminary. That I took a very unusual path to what I do. When I finished my PhD, my background was Church of the Nazarene. I got an offer at Eastern Nazarene College, which just closed this past December. But I went there in 1998 and was there until 2001. That was my first job on the South Shore of Boston. It was a great experience, great colleagues, great students, fun. But then I had an opportunity to move to Colorado Christian University in Lakewood, Colorado, in the Denver area. There again, I had great colleagues, great students, loved it. In 2005, though, I got an opportunity to move to Point Loma Nazarene University in San Diego. And it was a very good move for me because it was a more moderate theological culture and colleagues who were very actively publishing. And San Diego's not at all a bad place to live. Most people can learn to tolerate 72 degrees and sunny every day. But after I did that, and while I was there, I was able to publish quite a bit of stuff and got elected to Society of New Testament Studies, and my career was going quite well, but I was teaching mainly undergrads, and I was in my mid 40s, and I started to look and think, I got 20 or 25 more years. Is this very feasible? And I would ask the student, I had a policy, I'd memorize every student's name every semester, and I'd have about 200 students a semester. So yeah, it was a task. But to do that, the first day of class, or the first couple weeks till I learned the name, I'd ask, what's your favorite movie? And they'd answer back their favorite movie, or what's your favorite TV show, or your favorite singer, or something. Then I'd go back and investigate that stuff. And it's like, I don't care about this stuff. This doesn't interest me at all. And I saw the cultural difference between me and my students becoming quite profound. And I magnified that out on a decadal basis, and it terrified me. So I thought, what else can I do? I had a PhD in New Testament. I could read Greek and Latin, but I didn't have any highly marketable skills. So I thought I'd go back to be an academic librarian. My plan was to do that and then eventually go to a graduate school in theology and be dean of the library. Between Point Loma and Claremont School of Theology, when I became dean of the library, I went to Arapahoe Community College in the Denver area, worked as the library director for a whopping 11 months, and then went to Claremont. And then in Claremont, I assumed I was going to run the library, but they sort of sucked me back into the world of New Testament scholarship. So I taught New Testament there also. And that was a whole different experience because they were graduate students, and I worked with a lot of great PhD students. But then after I was there 8 years, to be clear, that was a great experience. Good colleagues, good students, very fun environment. But what I was started doing with the digital library while I was there had a much broader appeal, much broader focus. So, today we work with over 100 seminaries and provide them with their primary and often their exclusive library. And nobody else was doing that. I was kind of a run-of-the-mill New Testament scholar, but what I'm doing in the library world is more unique. So that's how I got there. But I still dabble in New Testament. I still serve on PhD committees and stuff. I don't teach classes as often just because of time commitments.
And then you get sucked into podcasts like this one.
Once in a great while, if the podcasters are particularly desperate for talent.
Yeah. Now, you also serve, I think, as a reviewer for some of the journals as well, based on your background.
Yeah. I've done reviews for all kinds of journals that people Google and they find my name and they send it. Blind reviews. I made a policy about 3 years ago. I only review now for journals which are open access. That is, they're free to anyone, anywhere. Because of this commitment goes back to the issues of wealth and poverty. The idea that we create scholarship and then we put it behind a paywall so that most of the people in the world will never be able to access it. I just decided I wasn't going to buy into that system. A little funny note, I was actually last week sent an article to peer review, and I read it, and in two places in the article it said author, date, page number in parentheses. And then in the bibliography, 2 places it said that. Clearly the author had just generated the
AI.
review by AI and not disclosed that. So that was one that
Yeah. You're going to see more and more of that. Money.
But the author apparently had not even read it, because if he had read it, he or she,
just pick it up.
They would have seen that and taken it out. And I probably would have passed the article for publication had it not had that. And it was even, and I said, I can't prove that it was AI generated, but it's extreme probability. But It was intriguing. It's like, who would do this?
We're going to save a little bit of that AI discussion for the next podcast with you on the DTL as well. You draw, and probably a little introduction because not everyone in our audience will be familiar with Wolfgang Iser, who I've read probably about every one of his books, I think, and Greg has as well. I think that's one thing that has drawn me to your scholarship over the years. But you tapped into, I think, in your first book, the Wealth and Poverty book, and then the subsequent books that you've written and the articles that you've done, reader response theory, which emphasizes, as you're about to tell us, how readers interact with the text and create meaning on the basis of what they read. Maybe talk a bit about that. You have those that are reader response critics, but are really pretty much narrative critics, literary critics, but they say they dabble a little bit in reader response. Then you have some that are really real reader response critics. Maybe it'll be helpful to describe the difference between the two.
Yeah, when I was doing my dissertation back in the 90s, we did have books back then for your younger podcast listeners. But back in the 90s, when we were still reading cuneiforms and such, the big issue in theological studies was the source of authority, particularly in biblical studies. The source of authority. Did the authority lie in the text? Did it lie in the author behind the text? Did it lie in the interpretive community? Did it lie in the individual readers? And that question, a lot of people were still talking about authorial intent. What did Paul mean or Luke mean or whatever? And others were saying, no, the source of authority lies in the text. So it's the text and forget talking about authorial intent. Other people were saying, really, it's the interpretive community. They're the ones who shape the way we understand it. So I thought it was time to, if I was going to engage in the contemporary discussions, I had to read those texts and think about that question pretty seriously. What are we doing when we interpret a text? Are we going after an intention of an author about whom we know almost nothing except what we infer from the text? That seemed problematic to me. Or is it the text itself? And then if it's the text itself, and Ezer talks about this a good deal, we have no uninterpreted interaction with the text. As soon as we read a text, we have introduced ourselves into the process. And Ezer has a fairly sophisticated taxonomy, a very sophisticated way of thinking about the way that readers interact with the text. And he took it from all sides, because some people said, oh, it's just subjectivism, whatever the reader wants it to mean. Other people said, no, he's really just still thinking about text-centered readings. But what he said is meaning, what we carry away with the text. It is the product of the interaction between the text and the reader. So it doesn't come from one side like everybody was arguing, or the other side. It comes from the interaction of the two. That idea made a lot of sense to me intuitively. And so then I spent a lot of time reading Ezer's work, thinking about how text and readers interact. And that then informed a lot of the later work I do. Even when I don't cite Ezer or don't talk about Ezer at a theoretical level, that idea of how text and readers interact and how readers produce meaning. And this is back in the days of Stanley Fish, when he was on the extreme reader side, and he was saying that really whatever we say the text means is largely a projection of our own ideas back onto the text. And of course, people reacting to that, particularly in conservative theological circles, say, no, it's the text. I became quite convinced the answer was in the middle.
Yeah. I think you're preaching to the same choir with Greg. And
we were reading the same things.
Influential on my hermeneutical processes as well. Maybe Umberto Eco was a second, but I agree with you.
Yeah, my master's dealt with hermeneutics, starting with Schleiermacher, so we had to track through all of those. Now, coming from a reader response side, I see that a lot of your work in Luke Acts is really in Acts. So, what about you as a reader was drawing you to Acts? Is it this material about wealth and poverty, and you're concerned about the world, or what's going on there?
Well, I don't know who listens to your podcast. So for the more pious among you, God directed me into the book of Acts.
That'll work.
For the less pious among you, it just turned out that's where the opportunities arose. That I was interested in Acts, and we started that section at Acts, consultation, and then a section at Acts on the book of Acts. And the people who were willing to start a section with me, I was a fairly young scholar, fairly unknown, were interested in Acts. We were interested in the same things, and they made me a great deal. They were all senior scholars, very recognized in the field. They said, look, we'll let you put our name on it, and we'll attend the sessions, and you do all the work. And they actually were quite faithful to that agreement. They did let me do all the work. But then we edited some books. And then once I was chairing that section, then people say, oh, will you write this? Will you work on this project on Acts for us? So it was kind of serendipitous. But it was good. I enjoyed it. But it wasn't that I had this great plan and followed it through. It was not that.
Well, the wisdom of being senior scholars is that you can turn a lot of things over to younger people and say, here, I'll support you. You go. You do the work.
Oh, yeah.
Tom, you worked on as we alluded to in the introduction, the Common English Bible. You're translating the Gospel of Luke for a pretty diverse audience. How do you make determinations in terms of how you wanted to translate the actual text? That must have been a really interesting exercise, and probably brought in some of that Ezerian influence that you referred to.
It did. At the time, Brad Kelly, who is a distinguished Hebrew Bible scholar and was my colleague at Point Loma Nazarene University, and Brad is now, Dr. Kelly is now the dean of the School of Theology there. He and I are great friends. Our families are great friends. And we co-taught an adult Bible study together and did for several years. And he was actually the lead translator for one of the Deuteromistic history books. I think it was either Joshua or Judges. I think it was Joshua. But and so what we did is I'd go in and I'd work on a translation during the week, and I'd bring it in and give it to the class and say, what do you think? And Brad, of course, knew Greek, but none of the others did. And we were just doing an exercise in reader reception. What do you hear here? And we got lots of great feedback. Both Brad and I did this with the parts we were translating. And when we talked about it, and during the week, I'd ask myself, okay, now how would a nurse in an ICU hear this verse? How would a homeless person hear this verse? How would a bank executive in Baltimore hear this verse or something? And I did that, but then I'd go in with real people. And for instance, when I translated the infancy narratives, and it's talking about a tetrarch, and everybody said, well, what the heck's that? Yeah, you never thought of that. Well, really. And by that time, it was actually just a title it means, 4 rulers, but it goes back to the time of Alexander the Great. But by the time of Luke's gospel, and even by the time of Jesus, almost a century earlier, it was just a title that didn't have anything to do with 4 rulers. And so I was talking about what a tetrarch did and what their authority was. And a guy who was a military guy, an officer in the Navy, said, well, it sounds like to me you're talking about a regional governor. And of course, he took that from his experience in Iraq. And I said, oh, okay. So we translated it as regional governor. Another example, when we were talking about the story of Elizabeth in the temple, and the text literally says that she and her husband could not have children because she was barren. And I thought, wow, that's first we know the gynecology and physiology of the ancient world. They assumed if a couple was having sex and couldn't have children, it was her fault, bad soil, and the way they understood reproduction. And of course, today we know that that's far from accurate. Yeah. But so we were talking about this, and I said, well, how should we translate it? Should we translate it literally, she was barren, or she was infertile, or whatever words you want to use? Or should we make it something that is more consistent with contemporary understanding of biology? And so I talked to them, and one of the people in the class said, started crying. My husband and I, we struggle with infertility. And the last thing I would want anybody to say to me is I'm barren. That's just abusive. Yeah. And so we scratched that. And so we said, translate it because the couple could not have children. And so that kind of thing, and over we had those kinds of discussions with people who didn't know Greek, but they were people who read the Bible and have read the Bible all their life. And we're going to continue to read the Bible. And so and I never went in there and lectured on them on Ezer and reception theory and that sort of stuff. But that's exactly what we were doing, reception theory. Yeah. And it was very, very useful.
Wow. What a great anecdote, a set of anecdotes in regards to the process.
When it brings the sensitivity to the text that other readers are going to have by listening to your own. So practicing reader response sometimes results in the best stuff.
Yep. Tom, switching over to Acts, where you spent a lot of your scholarly time, not all of it. In fact, you had sent me over an article on Luke 4 that came out a few years ago that you co-authored with one of your students, I think. It's a fascinating piece. The listeners on the podcast should check it out. In fact, we'll include it as a resource link at the bottom of the podcast. But, if you look at Acts, there's been a lot said about Acts, obviously, still a lot being said about Acts. What do you see as sort of the central theme and purpose of Acts, and how closely do you see it tied to Luke? Do you see that hyphen there, or do you see it the conjunction art, and in between? What's your views on those topics?
Um, yeah, and uh, that Mike Parsons, who really is responsible for taking away the hyphen and replacing it with an axe, he and the late Richard Purvo. But Mike's dissertation was talking about the ending of Luke and how it seemed so complete without Acts, and then you pick up with Acts. And then they wrote the book together on the unity of rethinking the unity of Luke Acts. That what I would say is the canon has clearly intended us to read them together. So on that level of together but not together, I mean, stuck John in the middle,
Yeah.
but together but not together. And I think that's kind of the way I look at it. Together but not together, and of course the reason John is between them is because Matthew was placed first because it's the only gospel that mentions the church, and then Mark was placed second because in the time they were framing the order of the canon, the assumption was that Mark was a condensation of Matthew, an abridgment of Matthew. Then Luke, as a synoptic, put John then next because it's the gospel. But I think that I don't have a strong uh, opinion on that, whether it's Luke Acts or Luke and Acts. I think you can make a credible argument either way. Clearly, Acts presumes the Gospel of Luke. It's not equally clear that the Gospel of Luke assumes that Acts is going to follow on. So that's the way I'd say it. If you're looking at it from Acts, then you're going to lean toward the unity of Luke Acts. If you're not, if you're a synoptic scholar, you may lean against it because there's nothing that I read in Luke that says, hey, more, there's a second act coming. Wait for next week, It's not Alfred Hitchcock. At the end of every episode, you get an indication of what's headed
No
next
teaser.
week. Yeah. There are no previews here, or at least I don't see them. And of course, Robert Tannehill wrote the narrative unity of Luke Acts, and he was certainly a good man. I think he's passed. He's certainly aged if he's not. I don't know if he's still with us or not. But anyway, Bob Tannehill. And that was a good book, and it has much to say. But he really starts with the assumption, sort of looking at it from Acts back. But if you do it the other way around, it's not obvious that Acts is coming.
Yeah. That's why Parsons, I think he was reading it because of his dissertation on the ending of Acts all the way through.
Yeah.
So, that was his presupposition. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
a good way to look at it. So, back to Acts, what do you think is the main theme or crux of what's Acts trying to do, in your opinion?
This reader, and I guess I should start off and say that, I'm deeply influenced by Joe Tyson, who's a marvelous man, and as a human being and as a mentor and a scholar, he was extremely generous to me. But I am the grandson of John Knox. Knox was Tyson's father, Dr. Father. Mm-hmm. So sort of, I never was inclined to read Acts particularly historical. That it seems to me, and Joe has done a lot of work on this, that one of the big issues for Luke in Acts, assuming it's the same, Luke in air quotes, but is the issue, how do we start with a Jewish Messiah and a Jewish church and Jewish disciples and end up with essentially a Gentile church and Jewish apostles? How did that happen? And was that somehow the providence of God, which he clearly thinks it is. I mean, he uses day, the divine necessity throughout, clearly thinks it is. But I think his readers weren't all convinced of that. And so I think what Luke is doing is a legitimating project to legitimate what happened. It's already, by Luke's time, I think the church is overwhelmingly Gentile, and that's happened. And did that just happen? No, from Luke's perspective. That was what God was doing. And then as a supplementary question, of course, there's been a lot of important scholarship on Luke and the Jews, that he has the question, if that was what God wanted to happen and God was pleased with that, and that was all the divine necessity, then where's that leave the Jews? I think those are the theological questions that really drive him. And that's why you have Paul introduced in chapter 9. And then after chapter 15, of course, you have chapters 12 and 14 where Paul's there. But after chapter 15, it's the Paul show that a lot of people have not taken seriously, it seems to me, that the God at the so-called apostolic conference in Acts 15, that after that, the apostles are gone. And there's never another mention of the apostles. Now, and Paul is not called an apostle except before chapter 15 and when he's with Barnabas a couple times in chapter 4. And Barnabas disappears after chapter 15. And so what happens, I think, is a generational change. And I think in my issues of wealth and poverty, and we can talk about this a little bit if you want, and in terms of this question with the history of the church going from ending very strongly in Jerusalem. You read Luke, it'd be like, it's like me, they're just going to stay in Jerusalem, stay there and worship him and in the temple and everything's cool.
Yeah.
And then you end Acts and it ends in Rome and in a household, a rented household that Paul rents with his own money, but not the temple. I mean, there's no Jewish temple in Rome, of course. And everyone who comes to him is welcomed. But the verses before that, he essentially writes off the Jews, as I see it, quoting that from Isaiah. You know, that I think for Luke, the Jewish mission is over. That doesn't mean that he's written them off to hell or anything. But I think Luke's just decided they have the original covenant. That's good enough. And if they do that, let them do their thing. And if they want to come into the church, that's fine. We'll welcome them. But the church is no longer about trying to evangelize Jews. I really think that's where he is. And the center of Christian, and a lot of people have noted that the center of Luke's world, the navel, they called it in the ancient map-making world, moved from Jerusalem to Rome. A lot of people have noticed that. I think people haven't taken it seriously. It also moved from the temple to the household.
Yeah.
And I think historically that's correct. But I think also it's ideological for Luke. He has given up on, of course, by the time Luke wrote Luke Acts, the temple, the literal temple in Jerusalem that's long since destroyed, I would place Acts in the, probably place Acts after Pliny's letter to Trajan. So
after 112 or so?
Yeah, after 112, 113. We're not exactly sure, but 115 or later, I've placed it in that because one of the articles I've written I wrote when I was at Claremont, co-wrote with another colleague. We're convinced that Luke was aware of Pliny's letter to Trajan, and when you can look that article up and read it, but we're convinced that. But the temple was already gone. But I think it's not just history he's reflecting. I think it's also ideology. He's quite happy with the temple being replaced with the household.
So, Tom, let me take you to the beginning of Acts, at least up until Stephen's martyrdom. And we have these places where it would seem to be happening, like you're saying, that the church, this household group, very idealistic portrayal of them having things in common. And then you go to the temple and things are somewhat dysfunctional. The temple, the apostles are getting beat or imprisoned. And so you have this contrast between the two, the idealistic church versus the inability of the leaders to control this new movement, which would seem to be playing into what you're saying here, is that there's a shift that's happened. But it's also this strong economic piece that the church is operating very differently, having all things in common together, this community of goods. So how do you understand these images that are coming out early in the gospel? Is it about contrast between the emerging church and the older Jewish leadership? Is it an economic statement? What's happening in these portrayals?
I did quite a bit of work at one point in the Apocryphal Acts, and it slips my mind exactly who it is, but the question of genre of the Apocalyptic Acts was one of the legitimate questions. And somebody said that first, when you think about tradition and what the Apocryphal Acts inherited, it was lots of conflicting traditions that they were trying to unify and present to serve their ends. And it's like, that's exactly what Luke was doing. It wasn't that he had the tradition or a tradition. He had lots of traditions. They weren't all consistent. Some of them, I think, were well enough established. He had to deal with them. And I think the community of goods is one of those. And I think he does that by temporal location. If you look, Peter is impoverished in the first half of Acts, that he lives off the benevolence of people, and some of them cheat him a little bit, lie to him, and end up dead, as Ananias and Sapphira. But he goes to the temple, and they're in chapter 3, and he looks at the guy, the beggar, expecting to receive something from him, and says, "Silver and gold have I none." Peter is broke. I mean, he has no money, he has nothing to give. And then, of course, he heals the man. But throughout, Peter seems to be impoverished. Every time there's an economic indicator about Peter, it is that he has no money whatsoever. He lives off of, even distributing the food. They have the 7 who do it when the apostles get tired of it. But it's other people's money in largesse, not his own, that he's just doling out. But after chapter 15, you go through Paul, and Paul seems to have money, and he pays for guys to fulfill a Nazirite vow, which would not have been cheap. And he pays for it out of his own pocket, it seems to be. Some people have theorized that he got the money out of the so-called Pauline offering, but that's importing the letters into Acts. And I think Acts was aware of the letters, but I don't think it was saying that Paul was doing robbing temples the way he claims he did in Corinthians. I mean, Acts doesn't give it makes it seem like Paul has the money himself, and he claims to be a citizen of Rome and Tarsus, something that's completely unparalleled for any Jew of the artisan class like Paul, a craftsman, whether he's a leather worker or a tent maker or whatever. A craftsman, to have that kind of citizenship claim, it's unheard of. There's no parallel. I mean, we have really rich folks like Philo who were Roman citizens, but citizens both of the city, and which would mean that he didn't get it by being manumitted, and that his parents were, or his grandparents carried away as slaves and then manumitted and got their citizenship that way. It happens sometimes for Jews, but that wouldn't give him citizenship both Roman and in the city. So the fact that he is portrayed as having both those, which, to be honest with you, is very historically unlikely, but being portrayed that way, this is a very upper middle class man. And at the end, he can afford to spend 2 years in Rome at his own expense in a rented apartment. That's kind of like living in La Jolla, California. It's not cheap. And I think what's going on is that Luke is historicizing those community of goods traditions that he had. It was fine, but it was back then. And by the way, it didn't work out. Ask Ananias and Sapphira. And then they had to appoint the 7 because that didn't work out. And then they ended up having a famine, and other folks had to feed them from outside of Jerusalem. So I mean, Luke clearly thinks it was idealistic. It was fine, and of course he's drawing this from a lot of the ancient philosophical texts that you have all things in common. And it's idealized, but it's also an idealized failure for him, a noble failure. But and It was okay then, but it didn't work out.
Didn't
What
work.
we have now is not the apostle Paul. We have Paul, who is consistently identified as a witness. And Paul is this post-apostolic figure who works hard with his own hands. He's, in his speech in chapters 20 and 22. He works hard with his own hand and provides for his own needs. He's very proud of this. And he can even give to other people because of the fruits of his labor. Now, Luke probably imagines Paul having more money than any artisan like that would have actually had. And he certainly portrays him that way, which suggests to me that Luke didn't know what it was like to actually have to work for a living. I think he was probably among the elite himself. But, so I think what's going on is you historicize those traditions, and then you have a post-apostolic witness, the Apostle Paul, who is the role model for the Church of Luke's day.
Yeah, it's interesting. They don't even make a lot of reference to benefactors.
No,
in the latter
Paul
part.
is a benefactor for himself of his own.
Unlike Luke and the first part of that.
Peter is just a middleman. He is sort of a client who gives out to those. Yeah. And in that regard, that Luke and Acts seem to be quite different because, of course, Jesus is portrayed not having money in the Gospel of Luke, and the disciples don't have money. But other than the feeding of the 5,000, they don't seem to be giving out stuff. They seem to be living subsistence. But so you have and then the apostles step out of that role, of course, when the 7 are appointed. But it seems quite different that Paul is a benefactor in and of his own right. But it's a benefactor that doesn't create clientele like you would in a typical patronage system in the Greco-Roman world.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point. Speaking of Paul, Tom, since you brought him up, or Greg did, you argue in your latest book back, it's been a little more than a decade ago, that Luke presents, I think you describe as a rehabilitated Paul.
Yeah.
Recast in terms of, more attractive to the church than of the late first century, early second century, which we just talked about. Talk a bit about why you believe that's the case, and what's your premise.
Yeah. Okay. When I did the book back in, I think, 2009, I was convinced that scholars had not taken seriously that we have multiple data sets with different levels of presumed historical accuracy. So there were a lot of conservative scholars who would take the 13 letters attributed to Paul and treat them all as authentic letters of Paul and primary sources, and then treat Acts as a historical narrative that was also pretty reliable. And so they'd come up with this idea of 3 missionary journeys and all that. And I was convinced that was, and then even scholars who denied the authenticity of the 13 letters, so they'd set aside the 6 disputed letters, they would still treat Acts as essentially a historical narrative. Even if they said they didn't trust Acts, then when you saw what they were doing, they were drawing on Acts. And it's like, they talk about Paul's missionary journeys. Like, you don't get anything like that in his letters. He wandered around places, but there wasn't a headquarters in Jerusalem that sent him out. And this is, of course, an idea that comes up in the 19th century with missionary societies. Then you get these missionary journeys. Paul's the missionary par excellence, and there's a headquarters in Jerusalem that sends Paul out. But if you read Galatians, even casually, that just sounds crazy. The idea that Paul would say, yeah, I answered to the people in Jerusalem, and I went wherever they told me to do. I mean, it's utterly incompatible with Galatians. And so I said it's time to very self-consciously separate the data sets. Let's set the disputed letters aside for the time being and not even deal with those. If we want to, that'd be a secondary question. Then let's carefully separate Acts from Paul's letters. And then let's look at the smaller data set and let's separate Paul's thought from his action. So all I was doing was like biography of where he went and who he had contact with. what he did, not what he thought. Because a lot of scholars would say, you know, we know Paul thought X, Y, or Z. And so then they use that presumption about his knowledge to fill in gaps. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be as narrowly laser focused on the actual biographical evidence as we could. Well, in Paul's letters, you have really just a few places. You have Galatians, which is the most important. You have 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul talks about what was handed on, and you have Philippians. That's pretty much what you got to work with. Mm-hmm. You have then Romans 15, where Paul talks about his travel itinerary after his upcoming visit to Rome. In Acts, of course, you have lots of stuff. But so I looked at that, and if you just read Paul's letters, how many times did Paul go to Jerusalem? I mean, let's get down to the basics. Well, Galatians is pretty clear. He didn't go right after he's converted, which Acts would lead you to think. So, and he went after 3 years, and we don't know exactly what he did in those 3 years, but after 3 years, and then he was only there 15 days, and he didn't even meet Peter. I mean, he's emphatic about this in Galatians. And then he went back years later, but he didn't get anything. I got nothing from those people in Jerusalem, you know. And then his attitude toward Peter in Galatians is just hostile. And then you read Romans, and Paul says, having nowhere left for me in these parts, by which he means the Eastern Mediterranean, I'm now going to come and see you in Rome. Now think about how well Paul was known in the Eastern Mediterranean. Well, Philippians and Thessalonians in Greece, you know, the northern Aegean there, but not far from Italy. And then other than that, it's only the very antagonistic letter to the Galatians. That's it. That's all you have in the East. And that's how Paul's known. Well, and imagine you were a Christian living in that area. And there were lots of Christians in that area in the time Luke's writing. I mean, we have witnessed this even in the book of Revelation, right? We know there were lots of Christian communities there. And all you know about Paul is he disagreed with Peter really, and James. James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter is sort of the premier apostle. And all you know about Paul is he didn't like circumcision. Well, that's not even an issue anymore, you know. And now, how inclined would you be to think Paul's your hero? He's a great guy. Not all that inclined in all likelihood. And so I think, I think there are good reasons to think that Luke and Acts, and certainly Acts, was written in this area in ancient Asia Minor, and to people who weren't all that thrilled with Paul or thrilled about Paul, and it is rehabilitating him for those people. And so you downplay the whole fight with Peter. You make him a premier subordinate to the apostles. You make him a witness to the areas in which they live. So I think that's what I mean by a rehabilitated Paul, a Paul that is conducive to them, and a Paul who's willing to compromise. Hey, you know, circumcision not a thing anymore, but he did compromise and let Timothy be circumcised. Which, if you read Galatians, what's the likelihood
Two
Paul's
different people there? Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, Paul would have because for Paul, circumcision meant Christ is not enough. You need Christ and something more, the law. Paul was never going to go there, the historical Paul. The Paul in Acts, on the other hand, he's subordinate to the apostles. And, you know, if you can kind of think of a good reason to do it, it's not that big an issue. No, for Paul, it's a big issue because it symbolizes something central to his Christology.
Yeah.
So, Tom, by this methodology of separating his thoughts and what you can get out of the letters from his actions and not conflating it with Acts, if Paul picked up Acts and read it, would he recognize himself? What would he think of this?
Well, lots of people have asked that question. And the short answer is, Paul would say, I don't preach like that. I preach Christ and him crucified. And in in Acts, the Christology is very different in terms of thought. So on the level of thought, but then on the no, I did not go to Jerusalem 5 times. I did not do that. And the thing is, some people would say, well, maybe in Galatians he wasn't being honest. And of course, it's possible Paul could have lied and other people have lied. But the reason it's very unlikely is he would have gotten caught. They could have fact checked him. By the time Acts is written, people aren't as invested in it, and I don't think they're going to be fact checking him in the same way. Although we have evidence, even Irenaeus recognized this incongruity. I mean, Irenaeus in 175, this incongruity, and he sort of had creative ways around it. But Paul could not have afforded to lie, because if he had lied, the whole letter would have fallen apart. Yeah. And then, so I just think Acts has created more visits to Jerusalem and a lot more dependency than the historical Paul. And I think Paul would be irate over that, he would be irate over the fact that he's only an apostle when Barnabas is named first 2 times in chapter 14, and it's the apostles Barnabas and Paul. And I'm not sure if Paul would have thought Barnabas was an apostle or not, but he most certainly would have thought he was. I mean, anybody who's read the Corinthian correspondence says this. Yeah. And I mean, look at the opening to Galatians. He strongly emphasizes his apostleship. Yeah. So he would throw it across the room when he realized they were robbing him of his apostleship. Right?
Well, let's jump over to the end of Acts. This notion that you're creating of Paul may be a little bit new to some of our listeners. And at the very end of Acts, here's Paul in Rome, and he has this statement, again, in Acts, whether these are Paul's words or not, where he makes the statement of he's going to the Gentiles. And one of the readings is that this is a very anti-Jewish, or at least anti-Jewish leadership, if not just anti-Jewish. But this is also the guy who's in Rome, where supposedly he wrote to the Romans about the unfailing promise of God to the Jews, and that the Gentiles need to suck it up and recognize that they're nothing without their Jewish brothers in this. So what do we make of this ending? Is it anti-Jewish? Is this Pauline? Is this Luke? What's going on?
Yeah, I wrote a piece on this and actually talked about it, and what I did in a way that I found easy to do scholarship. Like this person, and I was using his name slips my mind. I was using a scholar who argued Luke was very anti-Jewish. And what he said was, if you look at the major characters in Acts, Stephen's speech, Peter, Paul, their speeches, if you just look at their speeches, they all are very, very harsh on the Jews. Well, I know some of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible are pretty harsh too. But there's an element of truth to that, without a doubt. But I think you have to read the speeches in the context of the narrative. And then there are other people who read it sort of triumphantly, this triumphalist approach, like, woohoo, we're done with the Jews. Now we got the Gentiles, and this was God's plan. And I don't think either one of those readings are particularly helpful. I think that Luke has, like I said earlier, he has essentially said the church is done with trying to evangelize the Jews directly, and the church is done with the temple. I think the endings of the books sort of emphasize that. But I don't think that means that Luke thinks the Jews are just damned to hell. I think Luke thinks now we have the Gentile mission, and that has its own legitimacy, and that's been demonstrated in these books. And by the plan of God. And now we have a Gentile church, and we have Judaism, and Judaism's good enough. Or I think it's at least plausible and responsible to read Luke this way. That when I talk about interpretation and hermeneutics, that there are many ways to read a text. And I used to take students and do all kinds of mean things with them, have them break up and predispose them to read a text one way and then bring them together and have them argue about it, But I talk about credible and appropriate. And I got these from Schubert Ogden, and I use them entirely different than Schubert did. But Schubert was a great guy. And I'm sure that Schubert has passed. But Schubert Ogden talked about credible and appropriate. I use those words, but I use them very differently. And here's what I mean by that. Is a reading credible? So can I sit down with you and the book of Acts and say, see how I came up with these ideas, this reading, and convince you that that is a credible way to read the text? Now, that doesn't mean it's the only credible way to read the text, but it is a credible way to read the text. Then the second thing is have I convinced you the reading I have is appropriate? That is appropriate to the classic Christian faith, appropriate to the ethic of love for your neighbor. Is it appropriate? And this is an ethical category, not a literary. The first one's a literary and historical category, credible. And the appropriate is an ethical and theological category. So I want a reading, and there are many readings that are credible but not appropriate. So, for instance, I used to let Matthew's curse upon the Jews. His blood be upon us and upon our people. It may be credible on a literary level to read that as the descendants of the first century Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. On a literary level, it may be credible, but I don't think it's appropriate to read it that way. So I choose not to read it that way because I bring in appropriate. And on the other hand, a reading can be very appropriate and not be at all credible. For instance, I was in church one time and I heard the pastor didn't give the reference, but said, today my text, it was Mother's Day, is the Lord hath need of them, quoting the old King James Bible. And you probably recognize where that comes from, right? That if you go get the donkey in the fold, Matthew's off, what if somebody asks me what I'm doing? Well, you tell them the Lord hath need of them. Well, he was preaching about how God needed godly mothers. Look, that text is not about mothers. It's about jackasses, okay? This is not remotely credible. So it's appropriate. God does need godly. And so you see how credible and appropriate, neither one of them has the last say. They interact. And so I seek a credible and appropriate reading to the end of Acts. And so what I say is we have two covenants. The Jews have their covenant, and God's faithfulness to include the Gentiles did not eliminate God's faithfulness to the first covenant with the Jews. And I think that's a credible and appropriate way to read it. Now, it's not the only credible way to read it by any means, but I think it is a credible and appropriate reading. That's the way I choose to read it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It does.
That was a great explanation. Staying on the end of how readers process the end of Acts, you have that quotation from Isaiah 6. I think that's the fifth time it shows up in Luke Acts, if I remember correctly. And you go back and read Luke 8 in the parable of the sower, or the sowing parable. Yeah. There's a lot of connections there, but there's connections in Luke 24. It seems that from a readerly standpoint, it really draws together a number of threads that tie back not only in Acts but into Luke. What's your perception of how that all works?
Yeah, my doctor father, Joe Tyson, he worked a lot on, he was deeply concerned about Jewish-Christian relations. And he worked a lot on it, and he said, I wish Luke hadn't said that at the end. He said, I wish he just left that out. It's there, but the way I see it is that is Luke giving a final end to the Jewish mission. The Jewish mission is now over. They're not going to hear the story of Jesus and just let it go. And that puts them in the hands of God where they've been before. Yeah. And that's the way I choose to read it.
Yeah, both.
And by the way, I have Jewish friends who are quite happy with this reading. If you just let us alone and let us be Jews, we'll leave you alone and let you be Christians. That's fine with us. We're good with that.
Yeah, Pat and I both studied with Linda Maloney, whose new wisdom commentary on Acts kind of does that, where she's saying, yes, it is this notion about the prophetic notion that their ears are stopped up and their eyes are blind, but it doesn't end there. There is this notion that they will be healed. And so it is negative, but it also has a positive
Well,
connotation moving forward.
and that's why it's so important that Luke says Paul welcomed all who came to him. So it's not like no Jews allowed. If they come to him, sure,
He would
but we
receive.
don't go to them and tell them they need to convert anymore.
How do you deal with the last two verses there after the quote from Isaiah 6, Tom, in terms of, without hindrance? Paul was there in the house that he was paying for, preaching and teaching. What does that imply to readers? How do you interpret it?
I think Luke, like all authors, had lots of agendas going on. I think that might have been for the Romans. uh, that a lot of people said, "Look, you have these Romans; they're persecuting Christians." I think Luke, and there were, if you look, this isn't far removed from the time of Ignatius' letters. And Ignatius is warning people about trying to be a martyr. Don't go out and seek martyrdom.
Yeah.
And I think Luke has some of these same things. You can get along with the Romans if you'll sort of be smart. So they aren't just inherently hostile to us. And what little we know about uh, early second century Christian Roman relations is the Romans weren't particularly, even Pliny's letter, weren't particularly interested in seeking out Christians. It's like, if there's a problem, if it's just a rumor, let it go. If there's a real problem, give them a chance to get off on it. And see, even like First Peter, which, to be honest with you, I date in about the same area, about the same time, when he says honor the emperor, I mean, in the first century, second century, honoring the emperor without sacrifice, I don't think he has a problem with sacrificing to the emperor. Honor the emperor, he says. And like I said, same. I think Luke's trying to get his Christian folk to say, you can get along with Rome if you think well. Yeah, you think about it. Yeah.
So Patrick and I have been having this conversation as we've been working on our blog post about whether the hindrance is an external thing, people not hindering them, and how much of it might be an internal psychological. Paul's not hindered anymore by the things he was hindered by. Any thoughts on that?
Well,
he's not hung up on having to convince the Jewish leaders in Rome. It's like,
this is one where I would have to do some word study on that word that I haven't done. Not very many people in my lifetime, my professional lifetime, have accused me of being plagued by crippling self-doubt. But in this case, I wouldn't want to answer that. It's certainly plausible to think, based on the English word, that maybe Paul had his own internal conflicts and now he's just done with them. But I would want to do some word study on that word to see if the Greek word limits the interpretations there or not. And I have not done that. But that's a good idea.
Said like a good professor.
There's Tom's next article.
I'll check on
it. Yeah, one day I was sitting and it just came to me that we need to think more carefully about this term. Yeah.
So, Tom, it's an odd ending, as the church tradition is, Paul was killed, 66 or somewhere in that vicinity, and Acts was written a long time after that. Why does it end the way it does? Why doesn't it talk about Paul's death? What actually happened to Paul? Why is it so open-ended?
Yeah, that a lot of people have asked, why isn't Paul's death narrated? The short answer, of course, is nobody knows for sure, but I can speculate. If you look at Romans, Paul says his plan is to go to Rome and then on to Spain. And the only reason we assume he died in Rome is because that's where Acts ends. But if, in fact, Paul did what he planned to do and his letter to Rome was successful, they had money waiting on him, like he tells them subtly he wants in chapter 15, then maybe he did go to Spain and died in obscurity. And Luke just didn't know what happened to Paul. That's quite possible. Now, I'm not saying that's what happened, but I am saying that's quite possible that Luke simply didn't know, and nobody did. I mean, maybe he got on a ship going to Spain and the ship went down, or maybe he went to Spain where he wasn't fluent in Latin and he had a hard time with the language and he just sort of died of some unknown disease and obscurity in Spain. That it's entirely possible that Paul died an obscure, lonely old man. Now, it's not by any means certain, but I would say the ending of Acts kind of lends credibility to that possibility. And that's not the way most people think, because they assume Acts knew things that maybe it didn't know. But if you just looked at Paul's letters, that's what you would assume. And of course, that's what the pastoral epistles traditionally, people say, oh, Paul went to Spain and he wrote them from Spain, and so even the pastoral epistles kind of assume Romans, and that's what Paul did. And, and then the church in interpreting those has picked up on that. Now, I don't think the pastoral epistles were written by Paul, and I don't think that's what happened. But it is entirely possible he went to Spain. So you have two different lines of evidence that suggest it. Romans and the traditions about the pastoral epistles.
Interesting. Not the answer I expected.
That's right.
Well, I've disappointed better people than you.
Well, Tom, we've talked a little bit about the relationship of Luke and Acts. What about the endings of each? Do you see parallels, commonalities between the way that each of these ends, if they're written by one hand or even by somebody who's a really good copyist? Is there a pattern that emerges between the two?
Well, here's something. One of our former students at Claremont, Michael Koshinoff, is a student of Dennis McDonald. Dennis is a good friend of mine. I had lunch with him yesterday. And Dennis, of course, has made a career out of mimesis criticism. The ancient Greco-Roman practice of imitating other narratives, primarily Homer, but Virgil, all the narratives. And I think there is a project to be taken up by somebody who is skilled of looking to see, rather than the question, are Luke and Acts written by the same person? Looking and saying, if you were trained in mimesis, as every educated person in the Greco-Roman world was, and you were trying to write the story of Acts and you had the precedent of Luke, would you end Acts like you ended it if you were imitating the ending of Luke? I think the answer to that is yes. Now, that doesn't mean that's what happened, but as I said earlier, it does two important things. I mean, it reorients the reader from Jerusalem to Rome, and then it moves from the temple to the household, both of which were historically plausible. But I think there's also what looks like to me that could be mimesis. That could be the way to describe that parallel. And it could be the same person writing, but if you were writing and you were trained in mimesis and you had Luke in front of you, that I can't imagine you writing an ending that would be a better mimetic ending than the one that's in Acts.
We, in fact, have Michael scheduled for a show here in a few months. So
really,
it'll be interesting to chat with him. He and I have had correspondence, communicating back and forth on different topics. So we got one last question for you. I mean, you spent 35 years in the Acts scholarship. You probably already alluded to one of the things that we might want to be expecting to see in the arena, but where do you see Luke Acts scholarship going over, say, the next decade or so?
Let me go back into the Hebrew Bible. I am neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet. It's very difficult to predict the trajectories for scholarship. I would say this doesn't sound like a particularly scholarly or a particularly pious answer, but I would say the center of biblical scholarship is moving from the universities and the critical scholarship done at liberal seminaries to evangelical institutions, undergraduate and graduate. And so I see the questions that concern that community will be the ones that drive biblical scholarship, not the kinds of questions, say, Richard Purvo was asking in his hermeneutic commentary, or that Dennis MacDonald asked with trying to start a whole kind of criticism with Mennonite criticism. That for good or for ill, that's sociologically what I see happening. That if you're looking at, and even the scholarship is becoming less, I'm trying to make sure I don't offend anyone. The scholarship is even becoming less interdisciplinary than it was even 15 years ago. Like, say, Joel Green, who is a fine church person and a fine human being. Joel was always concerned about the church, but he went off and got a PhD in neuroscience so that he could bring that to New Testament. That kind of thing
doesn't happen.
It'd be like catching a leprechaun riding a unicorn. You just don't count on it. And I think there's certainly nothing wrong with doing scholarship for the church, but I think where historically in much of my career, it has been scholarship for scholarship's sake, and the church has been secondary, what it can glean from that. I think now it is directly in the service of the church, which may not even serve the church as well, because that independent voice of scholarship, and I'm speaking only for myself, not for the DTL or anybody else, but only for myself, because I think the church is best served by scholarship, which has an independent voice, and then the church can decide how it uses that scholarship. But if the scholarship is directly in the service of the church, that it's almost going before the Reformation.
It has certain presuppositions that it begins with.
If you see what I'm saying. Yeah, and I'm not, I work with all the traditions, particularly in the library I work in now, but I think the biblical text is served best when it is investigated as an end unto itself and let it speak. And that's a conviction held for many different reasons on many different levels, but I think it actually serves the text best. And when the text is served best, I think all the communities that the text serves are better served.
Yeah.
That sounds like a great teaser for our DTL discussion and what you're doing in that arena.
So Tom, we're going to put the link to the DTL podcast, which is forthcoming. And shortly after this is published, we'll have that one published as well. So the listeners can simply click on it. But how can our listeners get more information on the DTL or get in touch with you? What's your recommendation?
That our website is DTL stands for Digital Theological Library.org. And if they click on the contact button, those go to me. We have 10 employees, and a lot of those emails I forward. But if it's I always read them, and I'm the one who sorts them. Yeah.
You read mine, thankfully, or we wouldn't be talking.
Yeah.
So we'll include that at the bottom of the podcast. So for our listeners, make sure you check that out. Tom, fascinating conversation. I've always thoroughly enjoyed reading all your work and our interactions over the years. And thanks for making time to talk to us. Our audience, I'm sure, will find this discussion very helpful.
It's a privilege.
It's very delightful.
For our listeners, check out other podcasts at Scriptural Works. For other podcast episodes of Scriptural Works featuring co-hosts Greg Camp and Patrick Spencer, as well as a variety of different special guests, visit us at scripturalworks.com, YouTube, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. And don't forget to check out the growing repository of podcast companion articles found at scripturalworks.com. And finally, if you find our podcast episodes thought-provoking and helpful, make sure to share them on your social channels.